A sleek black Mercedes pulls up to a stoplight on a quiet suburban street one crisp autumn evening. Behind the wheel sits a distinguished woman in her judicial robes, heading home after a long day presiding over her courtroom. The red and blue lights suddenly flash in her rearview mirror, and her heart sinks. A feeling all too familiar to many Black Americans washes over her, that mix of anxiety, frustration, and weary resignation. As she pulls over, she takes a deep breath and reminds herself of who she is, not just a Black woman about to face yet another routine traffic stop, but a respected criminal court judge with over 2 decades of legal experience. Little does the approaching officer know, he's about to learn a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumptions. The story I'm about to share with you isn't just another viral video moment. It's a real-life encounter that perfectly captures the complicated relationship between law enforcement and the Black community, while also showing how dignity and knowledge can triumph over discrimination. Through the side mirror, she watches the officer swagger toward her car, hand resting casually on his holster, a stance she's seen countless times from her bench when officers testify in her courtroom. The irony isn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she was the highest authority in her courthouse, commanding respect with a simple rap of her gavel. Now she's being viewed through a very different lens. License and registration, the officer demands before even reaching her window, his tone carrying that familiar edge of assumed authority. He hasn't even asked if she knows why he pulled her over. The judge calmly reaches for her credentials, her judicial badge clearly visible among them, but the officer's attention is already elsewhere, scanning her car's interior with obvious suspicion. What happens next would become a powerful testament to maintaining composure in the face of prejudice. Instead of responding with anger or indignation, this judge does something unexpected. She draws upon her years of experience on both sides of the justice system to deliver a response that would not only change this officer's perspective but would go on to spark an important conversation about racial profiling in law enforcement. Her words, measured and precise, carry the weight of someone intimately familiar with both the law and the harsh realities of racial bias. But it's not just what she says, it's how she says it. There's no hint of the fury she surely feels, no trace of the exhaustion that comes from facing these situations time and time again. As-cam footage would later reveal, the next few minutes of this encounter would leave the officer visibly shaken, not from fear or confrontation, but from the profound realization of his own unconscious biases. This wasn't just another traffic stop, it was a moment of reckoning that would ultimately lead to meaningful changes in his department's training protocols. But the real power of this story lies in what happened after the initial confrontation. The judge could have simply filed a complaint, or let the incident fade into the background of similar experiences. Instead, she chose to transform this moment into something more significant, a catalyst for change that would reach far beyond that quiet suburban street. The question that lingered in everyone's mind was, how exactly did this judge turn what could have been another tragic headline into a teachable moment that would impact thousands? What were the words she chose that managed to bridge the gap between badge and bench, between prejudice and understanding? Stay tuned as we uncover the full story of this remarkable encounter, and learn how one woman's composed response to racial profiling became a masterclass in dignity, justice, and the power of maintaining grace under pressure. As traffic continued to flow past on that fateful evening, the judge's mind flashed back to a conversation she'd had with her father years ago. A retired civil rights attorney, he had always taught her that true change comes not from meeting anger with anger, but from speaking truth with unwavering dignity. Now, sitting in her car with the officer's flashlight beam cutting through her window, those words echoed in her thoughts. "Ma'am, do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer finally asked, his tone suggesting he'd already made up his mind about her. The judge noticed his body camera's red light blinking, a small detail that would later prove crucial to this story's impact. She could have immediately revealed her position, flashed her credentials, and turned the tables. But she chose a different approach, one that would prove far more powerful. "Actually, officer, I'd appreciate if you could tell me the reason," she replied, her voice carrying the same measured tone she used in her courtroom. I've been observing all traffic laws and my vehicle is in full compliance with regulations. The slight shift in the officer's expression revealed his surprise at her articulate response, another unconscious bias she'd grown sadly accustomed to observing. What the officer didn't know was that earlier that day, she had presided over a case involving racial profiling. She had listened to testimony from both officers and citizens, seeing once again how these encounters often stemmed from deeply rooted misconceptions rather than actual violations. The irony of now finding herself in exactly such a situation wasn't lost on her. The officer claimed she had made an illegal lane change, though she knew with absolute certainty she hadn't. His hand remained near his holster as he spoke a detail that would later become a crucial point in the sensitivity training sessions that would emerge from this incident. She could see him glancing repeatedly at her car's expensive interior, making assumptions that would soon be turned completely upside down. As she reached for her documentation, she noticed a young couple recording the interaction from their car nearby. In any other circumstance, this might have been just another viral video of police misconduct. But what these bystanders were about to witness would transform their recording into something far more meaningful, a masterclass in handling discrimination with grace and wisdom. The judge had spent years watching officers testify in her courtroom, learning to read between the lines of their reports and statements. She understood the power dynamics at play, the subtle ways bias could influence even routine interactions. Now, she was about to put that knowledge to use in a way she never expected. Before producing her credentials, she asked the officer a series of careful questions about department policy and proper stop procedures. Each question was precise, informed by her deep understanding of the law. The officer's responses grew increasingly uncertain as he began to sense that this wasn't a typical traffic stop. The dash cam footage captured every moment of his growing realization that something was different about this encounter. His posture changed subtly, his tone shifted, but he still hadn't grasped just who he was dealing with. The judge maintained her calm demeanor, building toward a revelation that would soon leave him speechless. What happened next would not only change this officer's perspective but would eventually reach police departments across the state. The judge's response would demonstrate how knowledge, dignity, and composure could transform a potentially volatile situation into an opportunity for genuine understanding. But first, she had one more question for the officer, one that would stop him in his tracks and set the stage for an unprecedented moment of awareness. As traffic continued to flow past, and the officer waited for her response, tension hung in the air. The next few moments would prove that sometimes the most powerful statements come not from confrontation, but from a place of wisdom and understanding. With her judicial credentials still tucked away, the judge looked directly at the officer and asked, "Sir, could you please explain the specific probable cause that led you to follow my vehicle for the past 3 blocks before allegedly witnessing a traffic violation?" Her question was precise, calculated, and loaded with legal significance that made the officer pause mid-motion. The bystanders who were recording couldn't hear the exact exchange, but they could see the subtle shift in the officer's demeanor. His confidence wavered as he realized this traffic stop was veering into unexpected territory. The judge's question wasn't just about probable cause, it was about the unspoken reasons that had really caught his attention. "I observed." He started, then hesitated, his trained professional demeanor showing the first cracks of uncertainty. The dash cam would later reveal those crucial seconds of silence, a moment that spoke volumes about the unconscious biases at play. The judge waited patiently, allowing the weight of that silence to settle between them. She thought about all the similar cases she'd presided over, all the testimony she'd heard from both officers and citizens. But this time, she wasn't sitting elevated behind her bench, she was experiencing firsthand what countless others had described in her courtroom. The powerful difference was that she had the knowledge and authority to transform this moment into something meaningful. The officer shifted his weight, his hand finally moving away from his holster as he sensed the situation changing. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job," he said, falling back on a familiar defense. But the judge knew this was the crucial moment she'd been waiting for. Her response would need to be perfect, firm enough to command respect, but measured enough to create understanding rather than confrontation. The young couple was still recording, their phone capturing what was about to become a viral moment of extraordinary impact. But unlike many such videos, this one wouldn't end in anger or conflict. The judge was about to demonstrate a different kind of power, the kind that comes from combining authority with compassion. She reached slowly for her bag, noting how the officer's posture tensed slightly at her movement. "Before I show you my documentation," she began, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone that commanded respect in her courtroom, "I'd like to share something with you about perspective." The dashcam footage would later show the officer's expression shifting from confusion to curiosity. The judge's heart was racing, but her voice remained steady. Years of maintaining composure in high-stakes courtroom situations had prepared her for this moment. She was about to bridge the gap between her two worlds, the respected judge and the profiled motorist, in a way that would leave an indelible impression. What she said next would not only change the course of this traffic stop but would eventually be incorporated into police training programs across the state. Her words were about to transform what could have been just another discriminatory encounter into a powerful teaching moment that would impact thousands. The bystanders' video was still rolling, capturing the mounting tension as the judge prepared to reveal her identity. But it wasn't just about showing her credentials anymore, it was about seizing this opportunity to create real change. She took a deep breath, knowing her next words would need to strike the perfect balance between authority and understanding. The officer stood waiting, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing awareness that this traffic stop was about to take an unexpected turn. The judge had carefully laid the groundwork for what would become a viral moment of justice served not through confrontation, but through wisdom and grace. Just as the judge was about to speak, a second patrol car pulled up, its lights flashing. The situation was escalating, but not in the way anyone expected. As the second officer approached, she recognized him immediately. He had testified in her courtroom just last week in a high-profile case. The layers of irony in this moment were about to multiply exponentially. The first officer, still unaware of her identity, began briefing his colleague about the supposed traffic violation. The judge watched in the mirror as recognition slowly dawned on the second officer's face. His eyes widened, and he subtly tried to get his partner's attention, but the first officer was too focused on maintaining his authority in the situation. "I've been following this vehicle because..." the first officer began, but his partner's increasingly urgent gestures finally caught his attention. The dashcam footage would later capture this pivotal moment: the confused look between the officers, the subtle head shake from the second officer, and the growing realization that something was very different about this traffic stop. The judge remained perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel. She had planned to handle this situation one way, but now, with this unexpected turn of events, she saw an opportunity for an even more powerful teaching moment. The presence of the second officer, someone who knew exactly who she was, added a new dimension to the unfolding drama. The young couple recording nearby had been joined by other bystanders, all sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The tension in the air was palpable, but it wasn't the usual kind of tension that accompanied these encounters. Instead, there was a growing sense that they were about to witness a profound moment of revelation. The first officer, noticing his partner's strange behavior, turned back to the judge's car with renewed suspicion. "Ma'am, could you step out of the vehicle?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. This request would prove to be the turning point that would make this video go viral for all the right reasons. The judge slowly reached for her door handle, her judicial robes now fully visible as she emerged from her car. The second officer's face had turned pale, recognizing not just a judge, but one known for her fair handling of police conduct cases. The first officer, still oblivious, was about to receive the education of his career. Standing at her full height, her robes catching the glow of the street lights, she cut an imposing figure. The bystanders' video captured the exact moment when the first officer's expression changed from authority to confusion, then to dawning recognition. But instead of immediately identifying herself, The judge did something unexpected that would later be described as a masterclass in handling bias. She turned to the second officer and said something that would eventually be quoted in training sessions and news reports across the country. Her words were about to transform this typical case of racial profiling into a powerful lesson about assumptions, authority, and the complex dynamics of law enforcement encounters. The first officer's body camera recorded his partner's reaction, a mix of respect and apprehension as he realized he was about to witness something unprecedented. The judge's presence, her composure, and the growing crowd of onlookers had created a perfect storm of circumstances that would make this moment unforgettable. As she prepared to deliver her response, time seemed to slow down. The judge thought about all the cases she'd presided over, all the similar stories she'd heard, and knew that this moment had the potential to create real change. The officers waited, the bystanders recorded, and the tension built toward what would become a viral moment of justice served in the most unexpected way. Turning to face both officers, the judge spoke with the same commanding presence that defined her courtroom. "Officer Thompson," she addressed the second officer by name, "would you please explain to your colleague who I am?" The first officer's expression shifted from confusion to shock as his partner quietly responded, "Sir, this is Judge Richardson from the Superior Court Criminal Division." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. The dashcam footage captured the first officer taking an involuntary step back, his face displaying a mix of emotions: embarrassment, realization, and something deeper. But instead of leveraging this moment to shame or humiliate him, the judge did something remarkable. "Both of you, please turn off your body cameras for a moment," she requested. The bystanders watched as she spoke to the officers for several minutes, her words too quiet for their phones to capture. What they witnessed wasn't an angry confrontation, but rather an intense conversation that had both officers nodding thoughtfully, their postures gradually shifting from defensive to receptive. What the judge said in those private moments would later become public when both officers voluntarily shared it during a department-wide training session. She hadn't just quoted laws or flexed her judicial authority. Instead, she shared personal stories about her father's work in civil rights, about her own experiences as a law student, and about the cases she'd presided over where good officers had made poor decisions based on unconscious bias. The first officer, his earlier bravado completely dissolved, found himself engaged in one of the most profound conversations of his career. "Your Honor," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I realize now that I—" But the judge gently raised her hand to stop him. What she said next would become the most shared quote from this entire incident. "This isn't about shame or blame," she said, her voice now carrying to the gathered crowd. "This is about growth. Tomorrow, I'll be in my courtroom, making decisions that affect people's lives. And tomorrow, you'll be back on these streets, making split-second decisions that do the same. The question is, what will we both do differently after tonight?" But the story wasn't over. As the judge prepared to return to her car, another vehicle pulled up, the police chief himself, having been alerted to the situation. Instead of tension escalating, what happened next would transform this incident from a viral moment into a catalyst for departmental change. The chief, expecting to manage a crisis, found himself witnessing the final moments of what would become a model for police-community interaction. The judge's handling of the situation had created not just a teaching moment, but a template for turning confrontation into conversation. In the days that followed, both officers would do something unprecedented. They would request that their body camera footage be used for department-wide training, not as an example of what not to do, but as evidence of how transformative a moment of honest dialogue could be. The young couple's video would indeed go viral, but not for the reasons most police encounter videos do. Instead, it would become a testament to how wisdom, dignity, and understanding could overcome bias and presumption. The final twist? The judge would later reveal that she had been on her way to present at a police training seminar about racial profiling when she was pulled over. As she finally drove away that night, both officers had learned something profound about power, prejudice, and the possibility of change. The dash cam's final footage showed something remarkable: both officers standing thoughtfully by their cars, engaged in what appeared to be a deep conversation, forever changed by an encounter that began with bias but ended with understanding. The story could have ended there on that street corner, but what happened in the following months proved even more remarkable. The first officer, deeply moved by the encounter, took an unprecedented step. He requested a transfer to the department's Community Outreach Division, where he began sharing his experience with fellow officers. His honest account of that night, of how his unconscious biases had clouded his judgment, became a powerful testimony that resonated throughout the force. The dash cam and body camera footage, combined with the bystanders' video, became part of a groundbreaking training program. But instead of using it to shame officers, the judge herself helped develop a curriculum that transformed her traffic stop into a blueprint for better police-community relations. She would often say, that night could have been just another headline, but instead, it became a turning point. The young couple who recorded the incident were invited to speak at community forums, where they described not just what they saw, but how it changed their perspective on police encounters. We expected to witness conflict, they would explain, but instead, we saw what real leadership and wisdom look like in action. The second officer, whose recognition of the judge had helped defuse the situation, found himself becoming a mentor to younger officers. He would often share how that night showed him the importance of speaking up when seeing potential mistakes, not just in traffic stops, but in all aspects of police work. But perhaps the most surprising development came from the police chief's response. Instead of trying to minimize the incident or defend the department's existing practices, he embraced it as an opportunity for systemic change. Working closely with Judge Richardson, he implemented new training protocols that went beyond the usual implicit bias workshops to include regular dialogue sessions between officers and community leaders. The judge continued her work from the bench, but her approach to police testimony subtly evolved. She began asking officers different kinds of questions, ones that made them think about their decisions from multiple perspectives. Her courtroom became known as a place where justice wasn't just about following the law, but about understanding the human impact of every action. 6 months after the incident, the first officer and the judge were invited to speak together at a national law enforcement conference. Their presentation wasn't about blame or shame, it was about transformation. The officer spoke about how one traffic stop had completely changed his approach to policing, while the judge shared how the experience had deepened her understanding of the challenges officers face. The viral video of their encounter has now been viewed millions of times, but not for the reasons most police videos spread. Instead, it serves as a powerful reminder that change is possible, that wisdom can overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from unexpected moments. Today, that quiet suburban street looks the same as it did on that autumn evening, but something fundamental has shifted in the community. Traffic stops in the area have become more about safety than suspicion. Officers approach vehicles differently, carrying with them the lessons learned from that remarkable night. The judge still drives home from court in her black Mercedes, and occasionally, she sees the first officer on patrol in his new community outreach role. They exchange respectful waves, two people forever connected by a moment that could have gone very differently, a moment that reminds us all that change begins not with confrontation, but with conversation. As for the dashcam footage that captured it all, it now plays in police academies across the country, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the power of dignity, wisdom, and the willingness to learn from our mistakes. Because sometimes, the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or authority, it's the quiet strength of understanding and the courage to create change.